Colleges and universities across the U.S. suspended testing requirements from their admissions process during the pandemic. That encouraged significantly more students to apply to the nation's most selective schools. That includes more applicants from traditionally underrepresented groups, such as Black and Latino students, first-generation applicants, and those in financial need. This trend could help diversify the incoming class at top colleges this fall. Washington Post education reporter Nick Anderson has been covering this, and he joins me now. Welcome, Nick. Thanks very much for being with us. So how has making test scores optional benefited underrepresented students, and why did that encourage them to apply to schools they otherwise would not have applied to?
Well, this comes back to the role of standardized testing in the admissions process. There's a lot of people who believe that standardized test scores are a barrier to wanting to apply to selective colleges. Students who might actually have a pretty good chance of getting into those colleges because they have strong grades and they have challenged themselves in high school, they might think twice about applying to those colleges if their scores aren't at a level that they perceive as what they need to compete. So if you take that variable out of the equation, then it allows students to make a choice. Okay, do I want to compete or not? Do I want to apply to Harvard or not? Just to name one school that everybody talks about. And I think this year, many students were saying, yes, I want to go for those top schools. And this evening, actually, we have some new data in from Harvard and the Ivy Leagues. They released their decisions this evening. Harvard admitted about 1,900 students to its next freshman class out of 57,000 applicants. Now, what's interesting there is that the number of applications to Harvard went up 42%. There's no explanation really for why the number of applications would go up that much, 42%. Unless you were removing a barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that really would seem to indicate, a shift during the pandemic with these changes. On the other hand, you reported that students with more affluent backgrounds lost some of their competitive edge this admissions cycle. What new obstacles did they face?
Well, okay, they have a lot of edges to begin with. I mean, let's start with the test preparation that they receive through tutoring. Let's start also with the level of support that they get at home, the nutrition that they get, the transportation they get, the extracurricular opportunities they get in excellent schools. So affluent students do have a leg up in the college process. And certainly that leg is heavy on the fact that they can pay the full tuition price for college, and colleges take that into account seriously. Now, if you are an affluent student and you counted on getting a good score, a good SAT or ACT score to make yourself as competitive as you wanted to be, and you weren't able to get that score in the last cycle, well, you might have perceived that to be a barrier for you. And you might have perceived that to be something that caused you to be less competitive. I'm not sure in the end that the affluent students will be less competitive. I think we'll have to see how that all shakes out at the end of this cycle. Right now, we're in an interesting phase where students have offers. There will be wait lists. There will be financial aid offers examined, and we'll see how the classes really shake out.
Yeah. Well, we have been talking about admissions into the most selective schools. What are some other colleges seeing right now?
Very interesting. It's worth noting that this higher education ecosystem in the United States is vast. If you admit 50% or more of your students, if you admit every student, there are seats at those colleges, lots and lots of seats, and there's opportunities for basically anybody in the United States who wants to go to college. You can go to college. It's worth emphasizing that. The less selective schools, I'm told, their applications were relatively steady in the last cycle. Now, this comes from the Common Application, which is a group that processes applications online for hundreds of schools. They found that applications to less selective colleges were more or less steady this cycle compared to the last cycle. By contrast, the highly selective colleges, their applications zoomed, and that may have been in part because of international interest in those highly selective schools, as well as the fact that students were applying to more schools, and therefore, if you apply to more schools, it's going to feel more intense as competition.
Well, I wonder, Nick, could the suspension of testing requirements become more permanent in the years to come?
That's a great question. I think the answer to that is yes in many places. The test optional movement was strong before the pandemic. There were highly selective schools that were going test optional even before 2020. And this has really accelerated the thinking of schools. Just to give you an example, the University of Virginia is a public flagship university in Virginia. It announced recently that it would be test optional for the next 2 admission cycles. Several universities in the Ivy League are announcing that they will be at least test optional for the next admission cycle. And so I think what you're going to see is that the selective schools are dipping their toes into the water of test optional, and they're realizing, well, the world didn't end, and we were able to put a class together. And now they might, at the end of the day, go back to having some kind of testing requirement, but there's a lot of schools in a lot of parts of the market that might think, I'm not sure that barrier is necessarily worth it. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the role of the SAT and the ACT will go away. There's many, many, many students who apply with test scores, even if you're test optional. It's worth remembering that.
It is worth remembering that, but it will be fascinating to see what, in fact, remains in place, after this pandemic ends, because it certainly, as you said, has accelerated the way of thinking and approaching some of these structures in our society. Nick Anderson, Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you.